Let's open up in prayer, and we'll continue our discussion on the conscience. Lord, we're so thankful to you that you have given us grace and mercy to be here this morning, and we are blessed. We need your help, though, to understand your word, and particularly as it relates to matters of conscience. And so help us to think rightly and be glorified in us, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so last week we began a series on the conscience. And as I mentioned last week, this is a continuation or a promise that I made last year when I taught the section on theological triage, because matters of doctrine and how we rank them as far as importance are related to our consciences and how we understand truth and how our consciences are informed by truth, and that impacts the decisions that we make then. And so last week we had to discover or discuss, define what the conscience is. And we looked at a couple less than perfect ways of thinking about the conscience. And we looked at two different cartoons. And if you go to the cartoon world for your theology, you will likely run into trouble. And we saw two instances of that. And so we're all familiar with the cartoons, from the Looney Tunes to the Disney characters, where a devil and an angel appears on the shoulder, and the devil is trying to get the person or cartoon character to appeal to whatever evil desire they might be having at that particular moment. And then the angel is on the other side saying, no, you shouldn't do that. And how that shouldn't inform the way that we think about the conscience, because the devil's not always right, and neither is the angel. And so the devil could be saying, do this because it's bad, when it's not actually bad. It might not actually be sinful to do something where your conscience is like condemning you because it thinks that it is. Or the angel could be permissive for something that is actually evil because the conscience isn't informed correctly. And so that's one unhelpful way of thinking about it. The other way is we watched that clip from Pinocchio with Jiminy Cricket and his definition of the conscience, and how he said the conscience is that still small voice in your head that people don't listen to. And actually the phrase it's the Lord of what is right and wrong is in that that statement in the Pinocchio. And that is an unhelpful way of thinking about the conscience, because the conscience then becomes supreme as the moral law giver, and it supplants God in that way. So the way that you're thinking about right and wrong, and that little still small voice in your head is talking to you, it becomes God. And so we want to avoid thinking of the conscience in that way as well. So those two things are unhelpful. The other thing we talked about is sometimes, and I don't know how we get away from this because it feels this way, but it's as if the conscience is something outside of us or external to us that is like telling us what to do and informing us. But in reality, when we looked at the conscience in the New Testament, in the places that it's used, and Old Testament parallels as well, we looked at both. When the term conscience is used, often the word that is translated conscience has to do with the heart. And in Hebraic thought, in the thoughts of the biblical writers, the heart refers to the center of man's thinking and emotions and will. Basically, you might say it's the immaterial part of the person or the soul. And so when the biblical writers talk about, the heart or the mind or the soul, or even the conscience, they're talking about you thinking and reasoning as an individual, your inner person. And so we talked about conscience then being you engaged in thinking about what is right and wrong and making moral judgments. And so I didn't put this up last week, and so I wanted to, because I had a big, huge definition. I think I lost control, Kevin. I lost control. Can I have that back? Sorry. I gave you a big, huge definition that looks like that, but, well, that's actually from another guy. But I condensed it down into this. This is much more simple, right? Conscience is a person's self-conscious judgment about what is right or wrong. Another way that it has been defined is a conscience is what you believe about what is right and wrong. And those two definitions are helpful because we live in consciously in the world, and we make moral judgments on what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Sometimes we override those, those thoughts, those moral judgments that we have. But our framework for what we're doing and the decisions that we're making is based on what we believe about what is right and wrong. Last week we talked about the moral law of God being written on a person's heart. It comes from Paul's teaching in Romans 2, where every person is born with this law of God encoded in them, in them. And Paul gives the illustration that, even Gentiles who didn't have the law of God proper, by nature do right things. They follow the law or principles of the law because of that moral law of God that's encoded on their heart. But what we argued last week is you've got that law encoded in your heart, in your being, but it's kind of like a database. Okay? So as you're going through life and experiencing things and making moral judgments about things, your thought processes access that database to determine what is right and wrong. However, because of our sin nature, the database is corrupted. Like files get lost or overwritten with things that are not true. Or the software that's accessing that database is corrupted as well. And so it's not accessing that truth, that law of God in the right way. And we can then make wrong moral decisions because our database is messed up. The other thing that can happen too, and I don't know if I talked about this last week, is how, if you're doing something on your computer or online or something like that, a message will pop up and say, warning about something, do you want to continue? And you can click yes, and you can continue like that. Your conscience might function like that as well. So, you might think about a moral activity and that thing pops up, should I do this? Do you want to continue? This might be wrong. And you click yes. Well, if it is something that is immoral and you keep clicking yes and overriding that, the software will learn that and stop asking later on. And that is what you might call a seared conscience, a conscience that's not functioning correctly that way. But all of that to say, we need to have our consciences informed by the law of God because our database has been corrupted. We need to go back and rewrite the files with the true database, and that's why we go to the Word and have our thinking adjusted and those files uncorrupted and put back where they belong so that when we're thinking about moral, right and wrong, we're accessing the right information. That's informing our conscience, having our minds renewed in that way. And when we do that, then we can begin to make right, proper moral judgments and have a rightly functioning conscience in that way. That's a summary of last week. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. Let's get into more controversy. Oh, not yet. So here are some implications of our definition. Again, I think I hit a lot of these things. Conscience, or our heart, it's our inner self. When the Bible talks about our conscience, it has to do with self-conscious moral judgments. It's important for our ethics and our moral action, but it's not central to our ethical decision making, okay? Because it is imperfect. The law of God, the scriptures, are central to our moral and ethical decision making. We need to calibrate our conscience because it can be misinformed, okay? It's like rewriting the program, putting those files back in the database so that we're accessing the right information. Again, we talked about the wrong ways to think about it, but the way the Bible talks about it as far as moral judgment. Now, within the community of faith, okay, within our church, each person needs to consider the consciences of others, okay? And this is where things can get sticky. Because as you have informed your conscience, it all depends on where you're at in your journey of faith and in your knowledge of the Bible as to how your conscience is going to be calibrated and how you're going to make moral judgments. And this is where, among us as a church, we can come to different conclusions about what is moral and immoral. And that, when we do that, that is an opportunity then for disunity and problems within the church. And so what we're going to do today is talk about conscience and disputed matters. Okay? What is a disputed matter? That's a good question. And people will disagree on what those are and what those are not. And so for the sake of our discussion, let me just talk about it in this way. I had an awesome opportunity last night to teach the new members class to a bunch of people, and we went over the statement of faith. And within that statement of faith, we've got some doctrines that we adhere to, that we believe in, that we think are scripturally based, that are not matters of conscience necessarily. Like, these are not disputed matters. Who God is not a disputed matter. Okay? The sufficiency and inerrancy of the scriptures is not a disputed matter. At least it shouldn't be if you're going to be a member of this church. Those things are laid out. And there are also ethical teachings in the Bible that are not disputed matters. Okay, as far as human sexuality goes, biblical manhood and womanhood, although that can get disputed at times as well. But there are just certain things. 10 Commandments, they lay out things that are not disputed matters. Thou shalt not means thou shalt not. There's no question to that. And so we would say, if we connect that back to our theological triage class from last year, there are first-tier doctrines that are not disputed matters, that if we have to believe in them to call ourselves genuine believers and followers of Jesus Christ. Those are not disputed matters. The second-tier matters, they're matters that are super important, and we all need to be on the same page with those matters in order to function well as a church together. So if you have a different view of baptism, and in our triage, baptism would be a second-tier issue, but we all need to be on the same page about how baptism is practiced if we're going to function as a church, and particularly since we have Baptist on the name, in our name, right, on the sign out there. And so maybe in some people's minds that's a disputed matter, but that is one that we need to agree on to function and practice as a church. But when you get to the third tier doctrines, and then into principles and practice, That's where there can be genuine disagreement among a body of believers, among a church, but we can still unify over those things, despite those disagreements. And so when we think about disputed matters, I think we can talk about them in 4 different categories. The first one is permitted but not required. Okay, so this is a practice that you might engage in that the Bible permits, but you don't have to do it in order to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Can anybody think of a practice that would be permitted but not required? Jacob? Feet washing. Okay? You can follow Jesus' example and wash each other's feet, but it's not required as a practice in order to be a follower of Jesus Christ, that particular act, as a follower of Jesus Christ and to be a member of this church. Other churches do elevate that foot washing to the level of an ordinance or a sacrament, like on par with baptism and communion. Okay? We wouldn't do that. Anything else? Permitted but not required. Doreen. Raising hands in praise. Yeah. We can do all those things if you want. But are we required in our worship service to raise our hands? You ever watched Tim Hawkins in his levels of raising hands? You know, some people, like when they worship, they hold the TV like this. And then it's he's got a whole system of it all the way to touchdown. Okay? All of those positions are permitted, but not required. All right? Good. We're gonna look at a particular situation in Romans 14 where Paul talks about actions of the church or things that people were practicing in the church that are permitted but not required, and they're a disputed matter. Part of the church is saying we need to do this. Part of the church is saying you don't need to do that. Okay? Permitted but not required. The other one is permitted but situationally restricted. Okay? You can do it, but in some cases you probably shouldn't. Okay? Anybody think of a situation where it's permitted, but in some cases you shouldn't? It's Penny. I think so. Okay? Yeah, we're gonna talk about that one. And like I told you, I'm gonna see if we can stir up some trouble. All right? Vanessa, was that a...
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes, like the pens, I don't know. I can't read the pen.
1 Corinthians 8.
Yeah. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 8 to 10, meat offered to idols, that sort of thing, permitted but situationally restricted. We're going to consider that passage next week. Yeah. Principles and prudence. This is where we enter into situations in our context, in our day, that are what you might call novel, like the New Testament church, the early church, when Paul is writing these things, wouldn't have a concept, like technological advancements, how we use, should a church use PowerPoint and projectors and stuff like that? Like Paul wouldn't have no idea, to what to think about that, or he wouldn't ever write about that because it didn't exist. Principles and prudence. And then the fourth category is personality and preference basis. When are we getting into, man, this is just basically a preference. And so this week we're going to talk about permitted but not required. Next week we'll talk about permitted but situationally restricted. And then the last Sunday in January, is that? Ooh. I got to see. I only got the month of January, so I have to see how that works out. But we'll fit in the other two as well. So if you would, let's go to Romans. Let's go to Romans chapter 14. And I know I got a half an hour, and I'm going to try to work through this whole passage. And that's going to be a challenge because we could preach a lot of sermons on this passage by itself. But I just want to hit some highlights and try to give us a framework for thinking about this passage and then how we might think about it in our culture. So in Romans chapter 14, let's look first at verses 1 through 4. It says, "For as for the one who is weak in the faith, welcome him, but do not quarrel over opinions." Okay? So the first thing that we notice here is you've got this distinction between strong and weak. There are Christians who are strong in the faith. There are those who are weak. And so out of the gate, it seems like Paul, as he begins Romans 14, is talking to people who would be considered strong. And perhaps they are the majority of the people in the church. Okay? I should preface all of this with everything. Romans 14 is not in isolation from everything that he's taught thus far. So Paul has been arguing for justification by faith alone throughout the book, and apart from the law, and he's making arguments that faith in Jesus Christ is the way in which we are declared righteous before God. It's not by doing works of the law. And in chapter 6, he anticipates the argument, well, if we live that way, then people will just live however they want because they'll say we should sin so that grace can abound. And Paul says, no, we shouldn't do that. So he's not arguing for an antinomianism, just throw off all of moral and ethical living because, there's grace. No, we still need to live as if we are dead to sin and not continue in it. We live a life of holiness and righteousness. And so there is moral and ethical teaching that we do need to follow, and it finds its basis in the law, in God's law. So as he has established all of that, and that's a very broad summary of all of that. As he's established it, now he's coming into chapter 14, where you've got these disputed matters between a weak person in faith and the strong in faith. And so his messages to the strong: welcome the one who is weak in faith, and don't quarrel over opinions. And that's where I think we're into disputed matters. Don't quarrel over disputed matters. Okay? And here's the first one that Paul identifies. One person believes that he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. For who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Okay, so here's our first disputed matter. You've got some people in the church that think it's okay to eat meat, and you've got other people that are thinking that, God is honored and God wants me to only eat vegetables. Okay, so it's the whole carnivore versus vegetarian argument here. Okay, which is right? Now, that might seem weird to us, but did the Old Testament law forbid meat? Why are these people vegetarians? So let me give you a suggestion on the historical context of this and how this might work to help us understand. Okay, so this is the church in Rome, and it's made up of a combination of Jews and Gentiles. You've got both of those in this church. And if you're a Jew living in Rome, you might feel like you're in exile. Okay, you're out of the promised land. So you're reading your Old Testament and you're like looking at your own situation, and it feels like I'm in exile. And if I'm in exile, I'm going to live in a certain way. And so you're going to look at the book of Daniel, and you're going to see Daniel was not going to defile himself with the king's meat. And so he was going to eat vegetables and do that. And so there is a thought then that when you're out in exile, there's certain measures of austerity that you should engage in. And then other people might look at the passage in Jeremiah that says, when you go into exile into Babylon, seek the good of the city, give your sons and daughters in marriage, and live your life. And in that way, understand that, it's not a time for austerity, and we can eat meat just like we would back at home if we were in the promised land. And so people's consciences and what they believe they should, how they should honor the Lord are informed by their understanding of these passages. And so then when you put this together in the Roman church, you've got Gentiles that aren't really concerned about food laws at all. Maybe you've got Jews in there as well that are taking the Jeremiah approach, so eat meat. And then maybe you have some Jews that are taking the Daniel approach and the austerity measures, and by only eating vegetables. And so Paul's like, okay, this is our situation. This is what you've got going on. So here's what I want you to do. I don't want the one that eats meat to despise the one who abstains. Okay. Don't look down on the person that is trying to honor God with their life by choosing not to eat meat. So you can see how that would happen. You've got brothers and sisters in the church, and they're like, man, look at those guys. They don't eat vegetables. They are missing out. You guys don't understand the Bible. You don't understand the situation. You're acting ridiculous. Stop being dumb. Eat a steak, for crying out loud. And then, on the other hand, he says to the weak, don't pass judgment on the strong. So then, on the other hand, you got these, we're the ones that are really trying to honor God by, denying ourselves of this, pleasure and, trying to do this. Or these guys are just doing whatever it is they want, okay? And they're casting judgment on that. So you got to go on both ways. But Paul says, God, don't do that because God has welcomed him. God has welcomed him. And so that becomes the framework for how we think about this in our relationships with people who disagree on some of these matters of conscience. And Paul says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? So in the Roman context, in that culture, what would happen is, they had slavery. And if you were a free citizen, then you were governed by the laws of the civil structure and all of that. But if you were a slave, really you're at the mercy of your master. The master's law is the law that rules you, and your master alone. And so if you were a slave of one person, you were under his authority. And a different slave was under the authority of his master, and one person and one master of the other could not cast judgment or say anything about the other person's slave because they didn't have authority to. Well, the argument that I think Paul is making here is that each person in this church has a master who is God. We're not their master. And so we can't pass judgment on them because we don't have that sort of authority. That person belongs to someone else besides us. And so we don't have that authority to say, you do this or you don't do this. That's not our responsibility. He's doing it before God. It's before his master that he stands and falls. God is the ultimate judge in this particular situation. And the Lord is able to make him stand. Okay. The Lord is able to look at his life practices and his moral judgments and be the judge of whether or not he stands or falls, whether or not he's doing right or wrong. So, that's the first issue. Then we get to chapter 14, verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Let each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of God. The one who eats in the honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in the honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then whether or not we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. Okay. So the second situation that we've got here is the adherence or the observance of holy days. Again, if we're thinking of this in terms of Jews and Gentiles in this church, the Gentiles are just going to see every day is the same. Okay? As far as our worship to God is concerned, there aren't particularly holy days that we need to follow and observe. But the Jewish community, that's what you grew up in. So if that's what you grew up in, to abandon that after a lifetime of adherence to that would just feel weird. It would feel awkward. Okay, so is Saturday, the Sabbath, a holy day that should be observed? Or what about the holy days throughout the year as far as the festivals and all of those things are concerned, the Jewish holidays? Should those be observed as well? In this context, I think it's probably likely that the Jews and Gentiles met on Sunday for their corporate worship together, but the Jews would also worship God in some way, shape, or form on the Sabbath. And to a certain extent, they would participate in their traditional festivals and holy days and all of that. And so here you have this idea like, okay, some of you are wanting to keep these old practices from Judaism, and some, don't really care. It's a disputed matter. It's an issue of conscience. Now, the difference between the situation here in Rome and the difference between the situation in Galatia is the purpose or intention of keeping those holy days. Now, in Galatia, there were these people called Judaizers that were saying, if you want to be a genuine Christian, if you want to be a genuine follower of Jesus, you have to have faith in Jesus, but you got to keep the law too. If you don't do both of those things, you don't have real faith. You're not for real. You're not a genuine Christian. But here, it doesn't appear that adherence to the Sabbath or these holy days is what people are connecting to with righteousness, in addition to faith in Christ, in the gospel. So it's not a gospel plus law situation like it was in Galatia. Okay. Otherwise, Paul would unload like he did in Galatia. All right? But if anyone preaches anything other than the gospel that I've preached to you, let him be accursed, an anathema. That's Galatians 1:6, I think. That's not his tone at all. That's not the message that he's communicating here. And so this is just like, you've got a church full of Gentiles and Jews, and the Jews, they want to celebrate Hanukkah. They want to celebrate the Passover. They want to worship God on Shabbat. And Paul's like, that's fine, as long as they're not adding it to the gospel. Let them be convinced in their own mind. The language of living and dying here is difficult to determine, but I'll suggest that that the living and dying relates to the old covenant versus the new covenant here. None of us, he says in verse 7, none of us lives to himself, none of us die, and none dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. I think that he might be talking about, like, if you're not going to observe that holy days, you're living to the Lord. Because that's the new covenant. That's life in Christ. But if you're going to die to the Lord. okay, if you're going to use the old covenant things, that thing that is passed away, you're going to do it to the Lord. Again, this is all under the presumption that we're not doing this in a way that's going to add to the gospel at all. He says, for this end Christ died, that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. Okay? Jewish converts, Gentile converts, same. He's the Lord of both of those. Then he goes on to in verse 10 and he says, why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? We will all stand before the judgment seat of God, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. Okay, so in these matters of these disputed matters, our ultimate responsibility is to God. And we will give an account for our actions and our attitudes in the way that we observe them. Okay, so here's the implication in verse 13. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of a brother. Okay? So withholding judgment on these disputed matters, and we're not going to put a stumbling block in front of them, and we're not going to put a trap in front of them. Now the question is, what is the stumbling block? How do we understand what a stumbling block is? What do you think? How would you define a stumbling block?
You have a couple over and you have a beer glass of wine. I mean, to me, I wouldn't even go down that road if I thought it was okay. I don't know what your stance is, so I'm not going to have that at the table.
Okay. Okay. What else? Okay. That's interesting. Like it. Jacob? Okay. Jane? Mm-hmm. Okay.
The first verse in 14 talks about not if, but they're, it seems largely they're of weaker faith. So if you go into it and, this dude is offended by this and filter through that lens, I think it's easy to say, I don't know where they're at. I don't know how long they've been saved, and really show humility towards, what are you done? Why is this bad for you? You know what I mean? It's just.
Mm-hmm. This is another place where the term stumbling block is used. And it's used, it's slipping my mind right now. It's used when Jesus says, basically, get behind me, Satan. You're interfering with what I'm trying to do. Okay? You're standing in the way of basically God's redemptive plan. Okay, so that's not just trip, it's blocking, okay? You're standing in the way. So I think in this context, the stumbling block would be something along the lines of placing a requirement for entrance into the assembly on a person that God does not place on them. So in this context, it might be that the Gentile majority is saying, if you want to be a member of this Roman church, you Jews need to abandon your Torah observance and not follow it. Otherwise you can't join with us. I think the opposite took place in Jerusalem. Okay, so if you think about the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, the issue there was, okay, we've got these Gentiles coming into the church here. We're predominantly Jews. Jews are in the majority. What do we require them as far as Torah observance? And as far in their entrance in the church. And what was the council's conclusion? All right, we're not going to put that restriction upon them for entrance into the church. We're just going to say that, hey, don't be sexually immoral, and just be careful that you're not overtly offensive to Jews in the way that you conduct yourself. So, really similar situation, perhaps, just the situation is reversed as far as who's in the dominant position and who's not. So you've got that blocking entrance into the church, and I think also what was mentioned here is causing a person to fall into sin. In that way, they're violating what they believe God requires of them for faithful living, and that is to do them some spiritual harm. Again, the common understandings of stumbling block were mentioned here. I'm not sure that Paul is arguing that we necessarily have to stop an activity that we deem is allowable just because someone else disagrees with us. Okay. Now, I'm not saying we throw out all prudence. Okay. There are prudential matters. That's when we get to number 3, conscience issue number 3. That might be the smart thing to do in that particular moment, but we don't have to align our consciences with someone else just because they disagree with us. Okay, so and that then plays into participating in these disputed matters when someone might cause someone to go against our convictions. Okay, yes.
Just I have a question going back to the first part of it, as far as the weaker brother goes, because he specifically here says the weaker one only eats vegetables. So what if I just don't want to eat how do you know if you're the weaker brother? Because I think the vegetarians here probably view the steak eaters as the weaker brother because they're not a steak eater. So it's how do you, struggle with that part of the passage, knowing, how do you know if you are the weaker person?
Yeah.
Is what you're doing the right thing or not? Because obviously they have that strong conviction of their side.
In this particular case, you keep reading and see where Paul lands on the issue. Yeah, well, he says everything is indeed clean. And he basically sides with the stronger people. Yeah. So then the issue is, where are you at in your knowledge of the Scripture and in your Christian maturity? So you're the stronger if you're taking a more mature position. And this is where you have to inform your conscience and inform your understanding of the Bible and what it says and what it allows, what it doesn't allow. And that doesn't mean, though, that people will disagree over who's weak and who's strong at the same time. So this can get very muddled and sticky at that point. Yeah, Jacob.
So when you say that, do you mean that the way you don't examine based on how much scriptural evidence you have
Yeah, yeah.
With the weaker person, it has to do with their faith, being deep in the faith. And I know for me, I used to beat myself up so much, rather than relax after a hard day's work. So I'd be like, I'm working so lazy, I'm going to do this.
Mm.
And I realized, after reading it, I was like, why don't I just have faith and thank God for the time off he gave me? And then instead of spending every night, working hard and miserable,
Mm.
I then went home rejoicing, wow, God, thank you, this is awesome.
Mm.
Relax and praise the Lord.
Mm.
So that's when you have stronger faith. And you can't eat meat or whatever. You just rejoicing and thankful to God with faith.
Yeah, yeah, and so your biblical understanding of rest might have matured, and you can go to the scriptures and understand that rest is a good thing, and you can allow yourself a certain freedom to do that.
But like pork, for example, obviously in Old Testament is forbidden. I think almost all Christians eat pork now. A pig is a very dirty animal, but obviously you've got a lot better systems.
Mhm.
So you could build a case either way. There's not an absolute, in my opinion, on you want to eat meat but not pork.
Mhm.
And so I don't think there's obviously an absolute on some issues.
Yeah, that's why they're disputed in matters of conscience. Yeah.
I guess for me, the way I go and evaluate whether something is stronger or weaker is motivation. I don't know. For me, like, for instance, you see with Paul, it says, right, in the Bible, help the mountains for the Lord with bad faith, but I have no love
Yeah.
that comes to them.
Yeah.
So motivation matters as much as just what are the consequences.
Yeah, I think love for our brothers and sisters in Christ is undergirding this whole passage here. Yeah, for sure. 1 Corinthians. That's so interesting that you bring up that, because he's talking about 1 Corinthians 13, which is called the love chapter, which, gets most of its play at weddings and whatnot. But really, Paul is saying, you Corinthian churches, you're a wreck. Like, you are unloving church because this is what love looks like, and you're not doing any of it. And so, really, the love chapter is a massive rebuke to a disunified church that is doing all of the things poorly, that we're talking about here this morning. Yeah. So in these disputed matters, right, being a stumbling block would not necessarily, I don't think, just be like if I did something in front of someone else that they disagreed with, but if I put pressure on them to say, you should do this. So if you go with the alcohol issue, if I was convinced in my mind that having a glass of wine was biblically acceptable, I would be a stumbling block if I put pressure on a person who didn't hold that conviction to do that very thing. And I think in our context in Romans, the danger here, and I'm running out of time and I won't be able to get to this, but the danger in all of this, Paul talks about destroying someone's faith. And I think what he means by that is, you strong Christians, if you're going to put pressure on these weaker Christians and their observance of the vegetarian lifestyle and their observance of the holy days, and he also talks about drinking wine or not in this passage as well. If you're going to force that on them, their conscience might fire so hard that they'll be tempted to go back into Judaism where they're comfortable again and abandon Christ in that way. And in that way, you run the risk of destroying someone's faith. And so, to me, that's the stumbling block, the issue of pitfalls. It's you're in danger of wrecking someone's faith and pushing them away from the church by putting these unnecessary, unwarranted roadblocks into fellowship in the church in front of them. Yes, sir.
The flip side of that can be true too. If they don't rebound back into Judaism, they may conform, but they're not doing it because they care what God thinks, they're doing it because they care what you think, which also destroys the faith. Great point, because your motivation for why you do what you do is just as important as what you do.
You can do all the right things for the wrong reasons. We want to marry both of those things together. Thank you, Dave. Any other thoughts? I don't have time to work through the rest of Romans 14 and because I wanted to get into 15, but let me just give you some principles to follow here. Some matters really are disputable. What you think isn't law, okay? What would we call to think otherwise? We would call that pride, okay? You are a proud person if you think that all of your convictions are gospel. Like, don't judge those who are more permissive than you, and don't look down on those who are more restrictive than you. It's a temptation that we all face. Every Christian should live convictionally, all right? Recognizes that you're going to give an account to God. So every moral judgment that you make is important because you'll be responsible before God for that. We do want to take into consideration our Christian brothers and sisters, but recognizing that our ultimate accountability is to God. So choose wisely. Don't be overly sensitive. Okay? Don't be overly sensitive. Don't change your practice if someone is simply judging you. Just because someone is judging you doesn't mean you need to change what you're doing. All right? Again, maturity is our understanding and right understanding and right application of the Scriptures. Okay? If someone is judging you or pressuring you to change from a less informed position, that doesn't mean that we need to change then. You might be willing, though, to temporarily adjust your practice to avoid conflict. I think that's what I meant to avoid cliffhanger. Avoid what? I don't know. avoid disunity, trouble, conflict, that kind of thing. Oh, yeah, I forgot. Exerting pressure, peer pressure on someone else to go against their convictions. So we might temporarily adjust our practice to avoid exerting that peer pressure and placing an obstacle in front of them on their way to Christianity. And finally, we want to live in a way that promotes genuine peace and mutual upbuilding, not merely the facade of peace. Okay. There's a go along to get along kind of mentality. But that can give the presumption that there's not an actual peace. People are just like swallowing things just to give this facade or front of peace. But genuine unity is a matter of heart and practice. Yeah?
Well, verse 21 says, "It is good neither to eat flesh nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I extrapolated, I didn't get to that point, but I extrapolated all of those things. So again, if that stumbling block is barring them from the church or causing a crisis of faith in them, we would adjust our practices for those purposes. Eric. Yeah, because I think one of the assumptions in this whole passage is the weak should not stay weak, right? You should be strengthening your faith. The weak should eventually come to the place where they can not cast judgment on somebody for eating meat if they don't get to the point where they can't eat it themselves. So get to the point where you can have that steak, or get to the point at least where you're not mad at someone else for doing it. Did I see it? And yes. Yeah.
And what their biblical evidence is. Maybe they don't have biblical evidence, it's just human or personal conviction,
Mm-hmm.
and a different level of triage. Versus if you have a lot of evidence, biblical evidence, and then you're like, oh, well, maybe I'm with my brothers because I'm making this choice willy-nilly, versus something I'm making this choice because of these passages,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to grow or to be, in
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, our children benefit when we're open, honest, this is why I choose to do it, this is a choice we make, and how we can recognize the difference between confusion matters,
Yeah.
story.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Communication and conversations are always good, right? That way we don't assume, that way we're less likely to judge, condemn, all of that. Very good. All right, let me close in prayer. Lord, thank you for our time together in your word and thinking about these matters of conscience. Lord, inform us. Help us to adjust our conscience where we need to.